I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I almost forgot what it was as I was saying it. A great sign for how this episode is going to go. I'm your co-host, Dean Detloff.
And I'm your other co-host, Matt Bernico. Dean, I've got a corkboard full of string and pieces of paper with different verses from Revelation on it this week, and I am perplexed. I am feeling troubled. This is going to be a hard episode.
I agree. I'm sitting in a room with 7 trumpets and 7 bowls of varying sizes, and I don't know where to put them or what to put in them or what should come out of them. It's a complicated one this time around. And I got to tell you, Pablo Richard, I respect him. I appreciate him, but this time around, I feel like he's left me even more confused than when I began.
Okay, so when I began, I looked at these passages. I'm sorry, first of all, hang on. Hello. Welcome to the podcast. We are talking about Revelation chapters 8 through 11 and 15 through 16. These are the chapters within Revelation where we're talking about God's wrath being poured out upon creation. Well, maybe just the unjust, not creation writ large. If you've read Revelation before, these are the trumpets and the bowls of Revelation. And we'll talk more about them specifically here in a minute. But what we're definitely here to say is that this is a difficult bit. Maybe the most violent, at least, that we've come across this far in Revelation. Pablo Richard, in his great book, Apocalypse, A People's Commentary on the Book of Revelation, he goes to some lengths to explain what's going on in these sections and why we should read them together, which is all very interesting. But I'm not sure that Dean and I are sold on them being good. Maybe they're bad, is maybe our perspective.
That's right. And, we're actually doing a kind of Pablo Richard mistake right now, which is to just drop listeners into this. I'm just imagining, what if this is your very first podcast that you've ever listened to, the Magnificast? Boy, would you ever be lost. And I'm sorry, you're not going to be found in this one specifically. You're going to get more lost. Don't start here. Turn the podcast off. Find a different episode. Nevertheless, maybe you're washing dishes right now. Your hands are wet. You can't reach your device, and so you're stuck listening to us. We've been reading the Book of Revelation with a number of different authors and commentators, etc. And this time we're reading it with Pablo Richard, a Chilean liberation theologian. And I won't review everything, but just, I think for folks who've been sticking with it thus far, so far Richard has given us a lot of tools to figure out the anti-imperialist method or kind of message or symbolism in the Book of Revelation. And that has been quite illuminating. The 4 horsemen, really exciting stuff. The martyrs, very exciting stuff, all going great. But this is the first time I feel like I've really run up against a wall where after reading it, I thought, I've got to go read about 80 other commentaries. And I didn't read all 80 of them, but I've read enough of them and I still feel pretty lost. So it's just going to be that kind of episode. I think we're going to vibe our way through it. We'll do our very best. But this is also going to be something we'll have to return to later on.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just a confusing one. So I don't know if this one isn't for you, that's okay. So like Dean had mentioned, last week we talked a little bit about the martyrs in Revelation, and all the cataclysmic events and so on, the horsemen and what they're doing, and these great horses that we don't like. These are the mean horses. But this week, last week the martyrs were asking for God's justice. We had talked all about the types of oppression and the violence that kind of carries on through empire and is bestowed upon the most marginalized people of the Roman Empire, and those who are living kind of on the periphery. And they're asking for God's justice. God, when are you gonna smite these dang fools? And last week, I think our position was, when is God gonna smite these dang fools? And now the smiting is here, and I'm not psyched for it, I guess is the problem. I think that the God could go a little bit easier. Last week we were saying it's time for that, and now we're feeling like maybe it's not time for that.
The particular smiting is pretty rough. I guess the section in Revelation, this one in particular, is a moment where there are 7 trumpets that blast. There are 7 bowls that get poured out. And Pablo Richard, to his credit, he does help in trying to kind of parse out what exactly is going on in those. So we can do that. We can figure out some interesting stuff there. And I think just to maybe get people back on the rails, it's not a set of totally incomprehensible nonsense the way that Revelation usually feels. But the more you make sense of it, the more troubling it gets. I guess that's what we're expressing here. So
right,
we'll try to
exactly.
make sense of it, and then we'll deal with how troubling it might be toward the end. And I don't know, dear listener, you can decide what to do with that.
Well, for now, though, as we're kind of wading into these 2 sections about trumpets and bowls, God's big ska band and dishwashing crew, the heavenly ska band, the general idea between these 2 bits is that these are 2 sections within Revelation that are kind of riffing off the themes of Exodus, but not being experienced by the Israelites in Egypt, but now being experienced by the marginalized Christians within the heart of Roman Empire. So it's the same kind of vibe where there are people crying out to God, and God kind of giving plagues to the people who are responsible for oppression. And then we have the sort of liberative moments and the end of history and so on. But I guess it's just it's one of those moments where there's just thing stacked on top of thing stacked on top of thing going on here. And it is quite difficult to make sense of it all, but let's get into it. So Richard says that these 2 sections, the trumpets and the bowls, are 2 pieces of the Revelation text that are meant to be read in parallel. They're parallelisms, meaning that they're kind of offering different perspectives on the same story. And he gives some rhetorical structures and some key elements of the story as sort of side by side bits of scripture that you're supposed to read together. And I think it's helpful to at least know that that's a good kind of handle for this text that is otherwise completely incomprehensible to me, that there are, sort of similar themes, movements, and linguistic structures within these 2 bits of Revelation that you're supposed to read together. For example, there's 7 of both. A helpful number. They both start with visions of heaven and sort of liturgical moments in heaven, and from then they kind of carry on and follow a similar structure where the first trumpet is about the bowl being poured out on earth, or fire and blood mixed on earth, and the second is about the sea, the third is about rivers, and so on. So they have similar cosmological and environmental themes. Environmental in the sense that they're both about the environment. They're about creation. I don't know. All of that to say that these are meant to be read side by side, and I'm not exactly clear on why that's important for the people who were reading Revelation at the time, but that is the case, that these are sort of parallel structures.
I mean, it is kind of weird because in the book of Revelation itself, the trumpets are in chapter 8 and the bowls are in chapter 16. So it's not like they're right next to each other. And there's stuff that happens in between each of those, a lot of spooky stuff and things that we'll also talk about next week when we get into discussions about the beast and all that kind of thing. But I think it is interesting to kind of see these two things as interpreting each other. That's how Richard puts it. Maybe to get them out here, to get the trumpets out here, the bulls out here, skanking toward the end of times, we can maybe just go through the highlights. I'll talk about the first 4 because 5 and 6 are a little bit different. Wait, is it 5 and 6 or is it 6 and 7? I'm already getting myself turned around.
Well, depending on which you're talking about, it is a bit different. It's trumpets 1 through 3 and bowls 1 through 3. And then the fourth trumpet and fourth bowl, I think, line up, and then the 5th is kind of confusing. It doesn't matter, Dean. Let's just get into this.
One thing Richard does do, he provides a great summary, an extremely funny summary of some of these items. And I do think it's worth getting those on the board here because I don't expect anybody listening to this podcast to go pick up their Bible. If you have done that, good for you. But in case you haven't, here are at least some of the Cliff's Notes. I'm going to read the summary of the first 4 trumpets, because I think that's worth doing. And then I'll look at the bowls quick. So, okay. The first trumpet. It includes hail and fire mixed with blood that rain down on the earth. Pretty yucky. And the result is that a third of the land gets burned up. Similarly, the first bowl that gets poured out on the earth, it offers festering sores to those who bear the mark of the beast or worship its image. So we'll talk about kind of how these things parallel as we go, but the immediate item is that these things have to do with what's going on earth. The second trumpet, a large burning mountain. It is on the sea. So that's pretty scary already. And a third of the sea gets turned to blood as a result of that big yucky moment. And similar, the second bowl, it also is poured out on the sea, and the sea also turns into blood, and every living creature in the sea dies. So the earth and sea are in trouble. The third trumpet, a large star burning on the rivers and springs of the water. That makes a third of the water turned to wormwood, or like poison water that you can't drink. So 1/3 of the water, that's blood. 1/3 of the water, that's wormwood. A bad time to be in the ocean. The third bowl, similarly, is poured out on the rivers and springs of water, and the water is turned to blood. And then finally, the fourth trumpet. A third of the sun, moon, and stars are struck, and that means a third of them go dark. They're dark. And the fourth bowl is similar. It's a bowl poured out on the sun, and it burns everybody with fire. Well, all the bad guys, it burns them with fire. So the point here is that you kind of have like a total vision of what's happening to creation. So you have the earth, the sea, the rivers and springs of water, and then finally the heavens or the sun. The next ones are a little different, so I'll pause and we can get to those later on, I guess. But I don't know, should we just start making our way through these first 4 trumpets and bowls?
Yeah, that sounds good. When you read them out like that, this sounds pretty bad, huh?
It's not good. It's not a good situation.
All right. So we've got the trumpets, we've got the bowls. The first 4 are pretty yucky stuff. Lots of stars, lots of blood, all of it bad. I think we can start. Okay, I think the most important note about these first 4 starts with the second trumpet. So in the second trumpet, the Bible says that there is a great mountain that's burning with fire, and it's thrown into the sea. So what does that mean? My brain asks. I have no idea. But Pablo Richard says that this is an indirect allusion to history in Revelation 8, where we find another reference to Jeremiah 51 that equates a large burning mountain, meaning Babylon. So when we hear the phrase, or when we read the phrase, the burning mountain is thrown into the sea, if that's a correct comparison, that from Revelation 8 to Jeremiah 51, perhaps the hearers of that would have recognized that the large mountain on fire is a reference to Babylon, which we also know is a reference to Rome being thrown into the sea. So it's like,
the corkboard is really emerging here.
This is why there's a pause the whole thing 1 second. Pause this whole thing. There's a part in here where Richard says like Babylon equals Rome equals Jerusalem or something. Like it's just like what is any of this, right? I don't know, man. But there's a bit of symbolism for you. The large mountain in Revelation 8 through 9 is not a large mountain at all. It's a reference to Jeremiah 51, which is actually a reference to Babylon, which is actually a reference to Rome. You can see where this is going and why this is so complicated. Not only is like the symbolism kind of stacked on top of each other in these like incredibly difficult and terse ways, but also like, I don't know, it's just like everyone's dying all the time. A third of people are dying. A third of people are whatever, burnt up. The sea is blood. It all sucks, man. Okay, let's talk about the third trumpet then. The second trumpet, the first and second trumpets, we've got those kind of figured out. The third trumpet is where we have a large star. This is the first of, I think, at least 2 stars that fall. In Revelation, it says that the angel blew his trumpet. A great star fell from heaven, blazing like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. And in the bowl, we get the angel pouring the bowl out into the rivers, into the springs of water. So again, we're getting sort of some similarities in the areas of effect. As if this was like your World of Warcraft character or something. Anyways, but the important thing here is that the torch falling is a reference to Isaiah 14:12, which is the reference to the death of a tyrant. So this is a reference that will come into play a little bit later, and I'm not exactly sure about why the repetition is important in this, but it is. So in Isaiah 14:12, we have the death of a tyrant. This is Richard supposes that this is the death of Nebuchadnezzar, and this is like God bringing them low, killing the tyrant, and then all of the water turns bitter as an effect. So interesting, an interesting thing that happens in the. I'm having such a hard time with all of this because it's just like I now know what some of these things mean, but I still have now more questions that Pablo Richard does not answer. So we'll have to go back to some other additional supplementary material later on or something to get the answers to these big questions.
Yeah, I agree. Maybe to like lend a little coherence to this, because I think it is easy to just get lost in the like, you know, just letting these details kind of wash over you and then trying to parse them out. Here are some things that we have said in the past about Revelation that is helpful. Revelation, you can try your best to parse out the exact meaning of every symbol, and insofar as you have the patience and skills to do that, you should do it. But at the end of the day, what is really being expressed in Revelation is the production of a bunch of different symbols that are trying to get a handle on a critique of Roman Empire, right? That's the purpose of all this stuff. So whether it's trumpets or bowls or burning mountains or the stars going dark or whatever, these are all kind of different ways of trying to get at both what's happening in Empire and a kind of Christian resentment toward Empire, which we can talk more about that theme of resentment later on. But I think that's the key here. You know, if you lose all the details, nevertheless, what emerges is a pretty strong desire to see the Empire punished, right? That's really what the trumpets and bowls are about. And one thing I do think is helpful in Richard is that he tries to, in that kind of equation that you mentioned earlier, he tries to pull in the prophetic tradition of imperial critique from different moments in history into his specific moment. So he says, for example, throughout Revelation, the great city is Rome, which is also called Babylon. Here it's also compared symbolically to Sodom, the idolatrous city, to Egypt, taken as a city and a type of the oppressor country, and to Jerusalem, mentioned indirectly as the type of the city that kills prophets, where Jesus was crucified. So we have here a concentration of the symbolism of evil. Rome equals Babylon equals Egypt equals Jerusalem. So what's the point here? The point is that this is a kind of like drawing together or like consolidation of an anti-imperial critique that John is self-consciously kind of mixing around. You know, it's an extremely postmodern book, this one. Just no concern for like finding the, you know, the interpretation of the author of the book of Daniel or Ezekiel or Isaiah or Jeremiah or whatever. It's a remix. It's a mishmash, a big collage of anti-imperialist literature finding its way into Rome. And that is actually very interesting and very cool. So besides all the absurdity of it, it's cool to be like, this guy in his big mental palace of Bible themes has decided to create, one big pastiche of anti-imperialism. That's interesting. That also does help unlock some of the kind of weird things going on here. So, for example, a lot of commentators look at the trumpet and bowls as echoes of the plagues against Egypt. And that is, I think, quite helpful, because the plagues, too, are pretty troubling. There's a lot of Egyptians, average Egyptians, who suffer the plagues so that the people of Israel can be liberated. And I think you see something very similar happening here in Revelation. And there's some pretty direct kind of callbacks, right? Like, just like in Egypt, the Israelites are kind of preserved from the plagues in a variety of different ways. Here, too, the people who don't have the mark of the beast are also preserved from all these bad situations. They are not stuck in, full of sores or getting burned by the sun or whatever. So that's also very interesting and helpful. And then lastly, I think the allusion to Nebuchadnezzar and the Roman emperor is actually very interesting, because Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon ends up signifying a lot of hubris, right? That's why Nebuchadnezzar is ultimately punished. And if you remember back to that story, Nebuchadnezzar is driven out into the wilderness, where he becomes like a beast and, becomes like a wild animal, essentially, which is a kind of interesting, like, fall from the height of absolute civilization, like wanting to create a Babylon that could oppose God himself, and then, being forced to, like, go back to nature. And I guess there's a similar desire here to be like, Rome is asserting itself over and against God in this idolatrous way. It's trying to build a huge hubristic empire, and nevertheless, at some point, God is just going to destroy all of that and kind of drive the emperor of Rome, out into the barbarian wilds or whatever. So that stuff is very interesting and very cool. And I do think that that equation, absorbing all that anti-imperialist critique, helps to parse out, like, some of what's going on here. The one thing that it doesn't do is make me feel any better about the intensity of this anti-imperialist dream. And maybe that's something that we can talk about, I don't know, as we go. But what do you think, Matt? Those first 4 trumpets and bowls as kind of anti-imperialist prophetic literature, how does that sit with you?
Yeah, I think that does make sense. The way that you're pitching it here, that's like the best possible reading I think that we can come up with in 2026, to be honest. I think, like, we can talk more about this as we go along through more of these trumpets, more of these bowls. It is also an extremely, like, resentful book. And that in a way that you just can't get around. Like, it is so much of, like, all of this bad stuff has happened to us, so now God's going to just, like, I don't know, like I said at the beginning, just smite these guys over and over again. And I don't know, there's a real uncomfortableness, I guess, I have with that. I guess, I don't know, there's nothing to really do but sit with it. It's like, it's in the Bible, there's nothing we can do about it at this point. It's not like I don't know, there's no new counsel to have to get this out of the Bible. And I think, like,
Matt's hard Lutheran pivot revealed here on this
finally
episode.
Yeah, exactly. It's just like, we have there is a good reading. There is a way that we can kind of process this to make it make sense within the framework of liberation theology, but also, like, there's an undeniability about the types of violence that we're seeing in here that just don't seem to me to kind of, like, to quite go along with what I know about the gospel, I guess. You know what I mean? Like, I can make sense of these things as expressions of resentment of people who are, pushed to the margins and who are oppressed, and that kind of helps me contextualize this. But at the same time, I feel like the resolution of the historical struggle of oppression and, the real movement of the abolition of the present state of things or whatever, this doesn't quite feel like it's kind of up to that task, if that makes sense. Like, it seems like when we read things like Richard Horsley, or we read I don't know, other sort of historical readings of Jesus and kind of like understanding what they might mean through the eyes of the people who would have heard Jesus, I feel like this is kind of a little bit of a different vibe than those stories. This isn't about the transformation of relationships and like the redemption of people. There is a lot of that in this book that we've kind of talked about previously, but there's also just like a type of hard violence here that is kind of inescapable that I don't like, and I don't exactly know what to do with. And like, maybe that's my own positionality as like a dude that lives in the global north, and I just like don't like it or whatever. And maybe it would feel very different to have somebody else reading this and explaining it to me, but it just is, it's just tough, I guess, is all I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, let's return to that in just a second, because I think that is really the key bit of this episode, is trying to process that and think it through, and we can riff on that. I want to get to the last couple of the last few trumpets and bowls, just to have it all out on the table here, and then we'll return to that. So the all this yucky stuff in the first 4 trumpets and bowls, everything's blood and burnt and not going well. That all happens. The 5th trumpet and bowl, in this moment, we start to kind of pivot a little bit to the more direct judgment of the emperor, or the kind of like, I don't know, the powers that be, you could say. In this one, a star falls from the sky, this is the trumpet, and opens the passage to the abyss, and locusts come out, and they torment the people who don't have the seal of God on their foreheads. The locusts are like horses ready for battle, and their king is the angel of the abyss. By the way, if you read Left Behind, these are military helicopters, so that's pretty obvious, I think, from the text. The 5th bowl is poured out on the throne of the beast, so this corresponds to the trumpet here. The beast's kingdom is plunged into darkness, and everybody bites their tongues in pain. And nevertheless, they blaspheme and did not repent. This is also a theme, by the way, in some of the other trumpets and bowls, that the enemies of God, or the people who support the beast, they don't repent. And that kind of mirrors the Pharaoh, the hardening of the heart of Pharaoh. Okay, so this 5th trumpet and bowl, the star falling to the earth here, and this opening of the passage of the abyss. For Richard, this is the emperor of Rome that has kind of fallen to the earth, and things are starting to go very badly. And in this case, the imperial power is also a kind of like, there's a spiritual element, there's a demonic kind of force behind that imperial power, a demon. And Richard says that demon ends up kind of like, I don't know, torturing people or whatever. It's all a bit unclear to me. But the point is that the emperor is kind of starting to like share in the suffering of all this bad stuff that's going on. So that happens here, and then the Roman Empire, when it finally is being, I don't know, judged, the darkness is really coming over the land. The 6th trumpet and bowl, in this case, 4 angels of the Euphrates River in the trumpet are released to kill a third of the human race. The number of cavalry troops is 200 million, and out of their mouths come fire, smoke, and sulfur. Those who are not killed are not converted from their idolatry and murder. So, a pretty bad situation. A third of humans are killed, and everyone else is like, whatever. I'm not going to become a Christian, I guess. Not a great evangelism strategy, if you ask me. The 6th bowl is also emptied on the Euphrates. Its water dries up, and the kings of the east are allowed to enter into the Roman Empire. This has maybe a more political, digestible referent. The eastern border of Rome is, I guess, the weakest in its political flank. And so the idea here is like, even from that place, from the east, the empire is going to fall. It becomes that weak. It's going to be destroyed. And then a bunch of stuff happens in between that bowl and the 7th bowl, which we won't talk about now. But the 7th bowl is basically the end of history. So at that moment, everything is finally over. There's a big angel who blows a trumpet saying that God's reign has finally arrived. The elders, they are thanking God. And in the 7th bowl too, there's a kind of it is finished moment. There's a huge global cataclysm and catastrophe that happens at that time, but it's like the end of empire. By the time you get to the seventh trumpet and bowl, the empire has gone through a lot, right? It's gone through the destruction of the earth, the sea, the rivers and waters, the sun and stars, and then finally the kind of enemies are at the gates, both coming from inside, from the abyss that's opened up in the empire, and from outside, from the east or from the borders. And so then finally God destroys basically the kind of foundations of the earth under the empire. It's a lot of work to unseat the Roman Empire. And I think what you see here are at least two things that we could use to maybe draw this into something a little more understandable. I think you see first a kind of profound political pessimism on the part of the author of Revelation, on the part of John. He doesn't really think that anything is going to make these imperial subjects turn against the empire. Even the destruction of a third of the human race, even turning a third of the waters to blood, all this stuff is not enough to make people turn against the empire. And as dramatic as all those scenes are, I guess I kind of understand that feeling. Like, you know, if you live in the United States, you're like, man, what is it going to take to get people to turn against this empire? Apparently not Donald Trump kidnapping the president of Venezuela or cutting Cuba off of all of its oil or starting war in Iran. Nothing seems to be, you know, even shaking liberals from being like, maybe the United States is not a good project, right? Like, I share that kind of pessimism on the part of John, so that's fine. The other bit, though, is that only God could finally deliver the kind of like cosmic judgment required to really unseat it. And I think that's important too, because what John is not calling for here is an armed insurrection, which is quite interesting. Instead, he's calling for a kind of revolutionary patience, to be like, we know the empire is ultimately going to be destroyed, but at no point are the people of God supposed to be the agents of that destruction. And that too mirrors the kind of Israelite captivity in Egypt, right? Like, Moses goes to Pharaoh, but at no point do the Israelites get up and take up arms against the Pharaoh. They just eventually get liberated. So a lot going on here, but I feel like that kind of like political pessimism, at least, is a pretty interesting thing to kind of read in the context of Revelation. I don't know, Matt, what do you think about all these trumpets and bowls now that they're all out here?
Yeah, this is my my least favorite Mighty Mighty Boss Tones album. That's for sure. Yeah,
Trumpets and bows.
I hear what you're. Yeah, exactly. I hear what you're saying. I think that makes sense. That there is a type of pessimism here. Maybe to throw a wrench in that particular reading or the pessimistic reading, there is this bit that Richard brings in kind of a little bit earlier on in the explanation of the trumpets and the bowls. So I don't know. We can talk about exactly if this. We'll talk about exactly how this works in a second, maybe, because I feel like you're right about the pessimism thing, but. Let me just read this. Let me stop hedging my bets and I'll just read it. Okay, so we've got the first three trumpets / bowls, and after that, on the bowls side of things, we have this kind of like liturgical intermission, and it's the liturgy of God's justice. So in the Bible, it says, "I heard the angel in charge of the waters say, 'You are just in passing the sentence, for they have shed the blood of the holy ones and the prophets, and you have given them blood to drink. It's what they deserve. I hear the altar cry out, your judgments are true and just.'" So this liturgical moment. I know, wild, right? And what if you were in your Anglo-Catholic Episcopal Church and like that was the liturgical moment for the day? No, thank you. I don't know. Maybe that'd be cool. Maybe not. It's hard to say. Anyways, Richard says that a liturgy is placed after the third bowl, and its theme is God's justice. This liturgy is like those that are elsewhere in Revelation 15 and Revelation 19. He says that this liturgy breaks in at this point so that the community may be actively present. Indeed, whenever the liturgy appears in the text, the community is making an appearance. Far from being a spectator to the exodus that God is bringing about in the Roman Empire, the community is involved in it, as expressed symbolically in the liturgy. So, like, I guess, like, on the one hand, like you were saying, there's sort of this, like, sort of pessimism. There's no, like, John's not like, and then you organize every workplace and have a general strike, and then, like, the troops can march into Havana or something like that. Like, that's not happening. But the community is present in this story in kind of a weird way, a liturgical way, which is maybe the worst way. But it's like, I don't know, the community participation does feel like it is full of, you're gonna get it later but not now. And that feels so weird to me, I guess, that like there's this like promissory note that like judgment is coming for the oppressors in the world, and the community is here to bear witness to that. But I guess the community being present, I guess, is what makes it feel so like kind of silly to me, that like they all know that judgment is coming and it's just a matter of time. And I guess it's just like it's so full of a type of like vengeance seeking that it makes me kind of like roll my eyes a little bit, which is wrong, but I'm doing it anyways.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that like there does seem to be a kind of contradiction even in the book of Revelation itself, because in the beginning you get this pretty powerful and profound expression of the lamb that was slain being the only one who is really like qualified to even start this whole process. And it's because he is the victim of empire, and he's the victim who stands in for all victims. And as we've been saying on the show, he becomes the organizer of all martyred victims in history, all this kind of stuff. And you get this sense of like Jesus being, you know, like what's unique about Jesus is that he doesn't do what the empire does. He does something totally different. But by the time you get here, you kind of get that sort of classic, like, I don't know, like a desire to be the one in the persecuting chair rather than the one to end the persecution entirely. And there is we were, before we started recording this, just looking up some other comments about Revelation in general. Friedrich Nietzsche, unsurprisingly, has a funny observation about it, where he says, well, just to preface, it's in the context of what I think is pretty anti-Semitic, so that's very bad. But what he says about Apocalypse is that it is the most obscene of all written outbursts, which has revenge on its conscience. And that is kind of how it reads. It's just like an extremely obscene, very vengeful, very like resentful kind of book. And this moment, I feel like up until now, I've been like, well, I don't know, maybe there's some more ways to understand all this stuff. Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza promised me there were, and I agreed with her and believed her. And maybe I guess I still kind of do, but she's going to have to do some more convincing for me to come around, because it does feel like that is like I said, a fundamental contradiction. You know, like the goal is not to end the empire so that nobody ever suffers again. It's actually to end the empire by basically saying like, God is actually bigger than you. Like, and which is also how it happened in Exodus, right? You can see the kind of internalization of a prophetic tradition. It's also how it goes through the rest of Israel's history, where the prophets keep going to the king and they say, you better shape up or you're in trouble. The king doesn't shape up, and then they get delivered over to, you know, the empire of Babylon or whatever. And God tells them, but don't worry, Babylon's also bad. They'll be judged too. Like, it's not like this is new. It's not like it's alien to the kind of prophetic tradition. But it does sort of feel like, whoa, this is such a weird moment where Christianity is like kind of trying to like pull itself out of the like vengeful, you know, like process of like going into captivity and then destroying the empire, and then also trying to just, I don't know, not depart from it at all. So I don't know. It still feels very confusing and internally contradictory to me.
I agree. It is confusing. It is internally contradictory. I think at best. I think that's the best we can do. Let's talk about a few other things within this section, within this chapter of Richard's book that I think might be, I don't know, helpful a little bit. So Richard has the bowls and the trumpets, and he, kind of following the text, right? We get trumpets 1 through 6, and all these kind of bad things are happening. Like Dean said a minute ago, the 7th trumpet is sort of like the end of the oppression, the beginning of God's reign. This is still not quite the end of everything, but this is where like God liberates the oppressed, or I guess however we might want to frame it. But there's a thing that happens between the 6th trumpet and bowl and the 7th trumpet and bowl, and that is like this kind of interesting interlude where in the trumpet section, we have what Pablo Richard calls the prophetic movement, where John is calling about his prophetic calling. In the bowl section, we have the anti-prophetic movement, which we have a lot of stuff kind of going on about the beast and the Antichrist and all this kind of stuff. We'll talk about the beast and the Antichrist later. I'm so sorry to do that because that's like the most exciting thing. But we'll get to that stuff later. For now, we're going to stick to the prophetic movement, and then we will talk about a really juicy bit of the Revelation mythos, the two witnesses, right after. So we have this bit after the trumpets about John's prophetic movement. The pericope within the book of Revelation is called "The Angel with the Little Scroll." So in this one, whenever I read that pericope, I always think of, I guess I don't know, my brain flips around a little bit, and I always read it as the little angel with the scroll, which I think is very funny.
A little angel with a giant scroll.
Could be. That's the way I'd prefer to think about it. Anyways, just a quick. This is a maybe a lesser recognized part in Revelation, but I think is actually kind of interesting with the stuff that has just come before it. So it starts off like this. I saw another mighty angel coming down from heaven. He's not small. Wrapped in a cloud with a rainbow over his head, and his face was like the sun, and his legs like pillars of fire. Richard notes that the angel coming down from heaven with his head wrapped in a cloud and a rainbow over his head is kind of signaling like the God of the Old Testament, like it's all the same God, but you know what I mean, kind of with the Old Testament imagery. Don't accuse me of heresy. Get off my back. Oh my God. kill the Redditor in your head who's making these comments as I read them.
Matt's Luther Gnosticism finally revealed on this episode.
Oh my God. So anyways, you have the sort of like the symbolism of the Old Testament God, but then you have the face shining like the sun, which is more of a Jesus reference, kind of all collapsing them into one figure, which is a great Christian moment where we're sort of delineating things here a bit. The angel that's descending from heaven has a little scroll in his hand, and it's an open scroll. Richard says that it's the scroll that we've talked about previously, with the 7 seals, which are not a parallelism of these two 7 things. Don't worry about it, guys. It's fine. Anyways, the angel comes down.
I'm snipping the piece of yarn that I just put between those two texts on the corkboard.
Thank you. You have to keep this thing updated. So anyways, we have this angel giving John the scroll, and guess what? John has to eat it, is what the angel says. This is what Richard says. John must not only read or interpret God's revelation, but he has to swallow it. That is, internalize it, nourish himself with it, and be satiated. God's word must come to be flesh and blood of his own. In the text, it says that the scroll is sweet to the taste. It tastes like honey, but in his stomach it turns sour. And Richard says that just like the sort of metaphor, our first contact with this is that it is pleasing and makes us enthusiastic. The sense being like, it makes us enthusiastic that we'll finally get vengeance on everybody who's wronged us. But then when we internalize it, we are obligated to endure suffering and persecution for its sake. So saying that, like, you know, when you have to spread the gospel, we have to, well, that's a bad word to use in this case. When you have to spread the prophecy of what John has been given, it's not great. You might be like really psyched about the part where you get to kind of like express your biggest and most bloodthirsty ambitions, but when you actually have to start telling people about it, they're going to be mad at you, and that's not going to feel good to you. It's going to hurt your stomach. You're going to get a stomach ache from eating this big scroll. So that's kind of interesting. Dean, any feelings about the prophetic bit here?
Yeah. Well, okay. Also, this kind of eating of the scroll is a callback to, what is it, Ezekiel something or other, or Isaiah?
That's right.
Forget. One
Ezekiel.
Of these prophets. Ezekiel. He also has to eat a funny piece of paper. Just like anything you should leave. Sloppy mud pie on that one. It makes your stomach sour. the thing that I guess kind of occurred to me, which is a bit tangential and did not come up in this commentary, but you know how like at the beginning of Revelation, he's like, I'm Patmos and I'm suffering because of what I said. There's a part of me that's kind of like, well, who put him there? Like,
yeah, exactly. Like, you're there for a reason, bud. It's because you wouldn't stop.
And it's like, we've all just decided that that's because the Roman Empire is like, get this guy out of here. But you got to imagine he's writing letters to every other church being like, you guys suck. You're not doing a good job. You got to imagine that maybe for his own good, some Christians also quarantined him off to this island being like, listen, man, yeah, I don't know. You got to like take some time. And that was actually the worst decision because then he did write this whole book. But anyway, that occurred to me. And I wonder, you know, like how much of that is also maybe true. Like insofar as John doesn't seem to expect the churches to be super excited about the message that he has either. So anyway, interesting, complicated stuff here. I will say, though, one other piece that's kind of intriguing here, Richard has talked elsewhere in the commentary about how when something bad happens in the Empire, especially during the Four Horsemen bit, you know, when inflation goes up because of war or whatever seems to happen, it's the poor who suffer that the most. And Richard kind of calls attention to our own time when, you know, if there's like a problem in a state or an earthquake or a natural disaster, the poor suffer that the worst. And there's something also here that Richard notes. So there are several places where in these trumpets and bowls, the people of God are preserved from the bad news of that. But there are some moments where they're not. They kind of share in the suffering as everybody else does. And there's a part of that too, right? Like you're obliged to endure the suffering and persecution for the sake of this revelation that this is going to happen. And I think that's kind of interesting as well, to be like, there's a recognition that even when the empire goes down, nobody is ultimately safe from the total consequences of all that. And I think that's something that kind of bears itself out even in revolutionary situations and moments and movements where, like, you know, I think of like the contradictions of something like the Sandinista revolution, where you have in Solentiname, for example, the community that Ernesto Cardenal, the revolutionary priest, was pastoring in. He was there talking with all these Nicaraguan peasants in a faraway archipelago, a chain of islands, about, you know, the Bible and what's going on in their own situation. And at a certain point, the Somoza dictatorship, you know, they heard about that and they didn't like that, and they went and burned down that entire village. And that was like in the context of this kind of revolutionary war getting going. And I think that there's something about that that's quite interesting. Or like to stay with the Sandinista example, the Mosquito indigenous people, you know, they were kind of on the fence about the revolution because they were like, well, what's this going to do for us? And at varying times, they either were interested in the Sandinista project or were kind of unconvinced, and in some cases even joined the Contras against the Sandinista project. So it's just to say, like, there's actually kind of a sophisticated recognition that, like, nobody, you know, the empire, for all its faults, it preserves a certain stability of violence. Like, there's kind of like a pattern or a routine or a way that things go, and you sort of find your place in it. And even if that sucks, you kind of know where your place is. And when all that is like, when there's a big upheaval, then everything is kind of going to be thrown into chaos, and those on the margins will also kind of suffer unique situations from that. So, you know, the sweet taste is like, the empire is going to go down, and that's very good, says John. We all know that has to happen. But exactly how that occurs and what you have to do to survive it, that part is not sweet at all. That part's quite sour. So anyway, you know, I think, like, with all the complications and contradictions here, there is, kind of like we said about the Horsemen, a sort of sophisticated, systematic analysis of empire that's happening in Revelation. And that, I think, is still pretty neat.
It is quite neat. Okay, thank you. Very helpful and enlightening additions. Let's take a quick break. Don't leave the podcast. We're going to do a quick pivot to talking about something else that's a little bit lighter, and then we'll talk about the last bit we have here before wrapping the episode up. Okay. Is that okay, Dean? Do I have your permission?
That's okay with me.
Okay. So Dean unpacked all of this great stuff about the prophetic movement and relating it to the Sandinistas, which is always what this podcast is great about. After that, in the Revelation chunk that we're reading today, there's a pericope that's titled The Two Witnesses. This has a lot to do with prophecy and prophecy within the book of Revelation. But before we get to what it means for the book of Revelation, I do need to talk to you briefly about the two witnesses as they might exist in the evangelical cinematic universe. In the evangelical cinematic universe, the two witnesses are these two characters who pop up, who, at least according to the Left Behind cinematic universe of evangelicalism, they are these two old Jewish men who do pop up outside of
Right.
Jerusalem,
Left
who
Behind.
are there. Yeah, in Left Behind, who are there to tell everybody that Jesus is actually the Messiah. So let me give you this quick synopsis of what happens around these two characters in the Left Behind universe. 2 weeks after the rapture, when United Nations Secretary General and Antichrist Nicolae Carpathia host an American and Israeli delegate who arrive in Israel to sign a 7-year treaty of peace. After that, Buck Williams and Ben Judah go to the Western Wall so that they can speak to the two prophets who have appeared, Eli and Moshe, men who are resurrected from biblical times to bear witness to Christ and begin converting the 144,000 Jews to become witnesses for him. A really quick note about this: there's the character within the Left Behind universe. His name is Ben Judah. He is a character who the Israeli government has commissioned a study of messianism about. So he before the rapture, they asked this guy, this great scholar, to go and figure out who the Messiah is, and then after the rapture, he comes out and says, "It's Jesus." So that's very funny. Anyways, they these two guys, the witnesses, they are resurrected from biblical times, says the Left Behind wiki. And the Nicolae Carpathia, the Antichrist and also UN Secretary General, he wants to kill them, but he can't, because anyone who goes near them, as the book of Revelation will tell you, they can't be harmed, and they can spit fire out of their mouths. So it's they're hard fellas to oppress, even if you are the Antichrist or the UN Secretary General, or both in this case. Anyways, I it's so stupid, but I never knew who these guys were and what they actually kind of function as within the larger text of Revelation. And now I do, because Pablo Richard can tell us. So you can take all of that Left Behind garbage in your brain, put it in a big bag, and throw it right in the trash. We don't need it anymore, because now we know at least who these two witnesses really are. So Richard says, after presenting John's calling to prophecy, the text continues with the prophetic testimony of the whole church. Here we have a narrative or symbolic representation of the church in this present time between Christ's resurrection and the end, with these two witnesses. So these two witnesses are supposed to be stand-ins for the church. Wild stuff. He goes on to kind of say a few other things about why this is the case, or kind of how this symbol works out. But he mentions they're wearing sackcloth to denote that they're sort of impoverished, they're poor people, and so on. They're people who are persecuted, but God isn't going to let that persecution end them or whatever. But then there's this other really interesting bit here too, where Richard says, "Why are there two witnesses or two martyrs that are here?" And he says, because for every valid testimony, for every valid witness, there has to always be two witnesses. There has to be, a person to carry out whatever and another person to actually witness it. He says, however, the background here is also made up of Zechariah 4, where the two olive trees are Joshua and Zerubbabel, the political and religious leaders of the restoration of the temple. There is likewise an allusion to Moses and to Elijah, or political and prophetic power, and perhaps there is also some thought of Peter and Paul as well. In any case, the two witnesses/prophets represent the church. The whole community is called to be the prophet and witness in the present time. So this kind of interesting aside where we get this prophetic movement and how John is kind of called to prophecy and what that prophetic movement means. but it also incorporates into the church as a whole. So everybody's supposed to be involved in this, more or less. The thing that tastes sweet and you're enthusiastic for, and then also hurts your stomach at the same time. A really interesting dispelling of weird stuff within the the Revelation cinematic universe. Pretty important. It's all silly. It's all extremely silly. To me, it seemed important to lay out, at least to some extent, because if you do just like Google who the two witnesses are in Revelation, it does bring you to the Left Behind fandom wiki. So I want to get it all out there that this is there's something actually going on behind the text here that is like not which is not like magical guys who breathe fire. So kind of a bummer on one hand, but it's good to know what's actually going on in the text, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, that also, the kind of like piling on of potential allusions or symbolism on the two witnesses, that's similar to the piling on of allusions for the Roman Empire. Like, it is Babylon, and it's whatever, the city that crucified Jesus, and it's also all these other places here too. The two witnesses are all these kinds of different things at once. It's like, it's the concentration of a prophetic kind of energy, like produced by all these different symbols into new symbols in the book of Revelation. And I do think that is quite interesting and cool. We'll talk later, I guess, too, about how these prophets, they also have like a kind of there's like the bizarro versions of them, or the evil versions of them. Right. The beast has two prophets. We can get into all that probably next time. But there's something kind of interesting about, I guess, just like trying to understand that what John is telling Christians to do is to totally reject the Roman Empire, because also they know that, at some point, just by virtue of bearing witness to this alternative that is not empire, they'll be rewarded. And that's all interesting. I still think there's some pretty weird stuff here that's not exactly explained by Richard. He lets himself off the hook. I mean, the church is not breathing fire at everybody around us and killing our enemies with it. Like, I'm not convinced that that's exactly what's going on here. There's lots of other kinds of questions that are raised, but maybe toward the end, instead of trying to parse out even more symbols with the last few minutes here, we can kind of close with some final reflections on the weirdness of the resentment theme. How does that sound as a way to land the plane?
Yeah, no, that sounds great.
Okay. So, I think that obviously on this podcast, also, we have explored questions around violence and revolutionary violence, and at what point does a kind of situation seem to allow for a justifiable expression of violence against conditions of oppression, etc. And I think that, Christians can have a very mature conversation about that. And that is also something liberation theology has always done. It has taken seriously the fact that there could be conditions so bad, so evil, so ingrained, that maybe the best way to defeat them, regrettably, is an armed revolution. And that, I think, is a fair thing to consider and be open to, and that's fine. And I think at some point this year, we'll look at Alan Bozak, who is a really fascinating South African pastor, Reformed pastor, an African Black Reformed pastor. He also kind of reads this set of stuff I was looking earlier as like basically the justification of revolutionary violence. And in his case, he's like in apartheid South Africa. Maybe that makes a little more sense. So, like insofar as that, this like kind of unleashing of violent fantasy in Revelation, I guess, can like connect with those who feel totally oppressed by the empire. Like, who am I to like take that away from them, I guess? So that's one caveat to say here. That being said, I do find it kind of bizarre that, as we mentioned earlier, the call here is not actually to take up arms. In fact, it's a kind of explicit rejection of that strategy. Yeah. And instead is a call to get lost in the violent fantasy of the future, to be like, someday, don't worry, God will come here and just like absolutely wreck everybody. And won't that be great when that happens? And we will all be like, they got what they deserved, and these thousands and thousands of people are going to die as a result. And I think there is like, I think it's okay to be like, that's not good. don't think that we should like have that violent fantasy. So I guess, you know, I think like it's interesting that people have tried to save it and have tried to contextualize it and all of that. But at this stage, I'm willing to be convinced by others later on. At this stage, I feel like the 6 trumpets and 6 bowls, they're not doing it for me. I think they're more a liability than they are a good opportunity. What do you think, Matt?
Yeah, I feel basically the same way. Maybe like I am willing to believe I just don't have the eyes to see this and the ears to hear it or something like that is, I think, likely. Well, here, I guess this is what Richard says, kind of at the end of the chapter after the 7th trumpet, and we hear, you know, all about the 24 elders and how they're so super psyched about these trumpets and they're like really happy about what God has done. Richard says this: God does justice for the oppressed and liberates them. God does justice to the oppressors and destroys them. The Exodus is God's great judgment. This is bad news for sinners, but good news for holy ones, or, you know, the poor in this case. This judgment of God is not reduced to God's last and final judgment. On the contrary, God's justice or liberating action in history is occurring, especially now in the present age. In this passage, the judgment takes place with the arrival of the kingdom. So we have these ideas that like it's kind of difficult because, you know, Richard's trying to make sense of this just like we are, I think, and, you know, he's doing a cool job, an interesting job of doing that. But Richard is like, I think, is being a little bit too generous in the way that he applies some of the liberation theology lens to what's happening with the trumpets, is I guess how I feel. Mm-hmm. Because like you're saying, Dean, I don't feel like what we're seeing in Revelation is necessarily liberatory. Or, I mean, maybe it is in the big scheme, but it's not liberation in the way that like we know liberation to kind of happen. You know, like it's not about a call to arms or a call to organization or a call to a particular type of tactic or anything. It's like you said, kind of like getting lost in a violent fantasy and getting psyched about that fantasy, like the fantasy about it. And I guess that does carry through the thing that we said last week about the cry of the oppressed people, in that there's something kind of like actually very pacifying about that expectation of divine violence on the other side of history that you just kind of have to wait for, that I am not thrilled about, I guess, or it just like does not quite work for me. So I don't know. What Richard is saying is really interesting, and like, you know, if it is the case that I just like don't get it and I you know don't have the particular life experience or like position in history and social position, then like fair enough, I'll take his word for it. And like you said, I wouldn't want to take that away from anybody who finds it to be like particularly important or helpful in that realm. But if I'm using my critical sort of perspective and I'm right about this or whatever, it just doesn't seem like it's really delivering what Richard says it's delivering.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's also interesting just to think through like what the concrete advice is that's being given here in Revelation.
Yeah.
And you know what it kind of reminded me of is so Matt and I both used to be very interested in anarcho-primitivism, a Christian form of that, which is like anti-civilization. Civilization is bad. It comes from people like Jacques Ellul, but many other people as well. And I feel like in many respects that is a pretty close example of kind of what Revelation is after, which is to say, like, you do your best to drop out of society as much as possible. So like when I was invested in that subculture, you know, you eat out of dumpsters and you don't buy new clothes and you like only really try to survive off of like the scrappings of empire. And, you know, you kind of like, you lead an extremely like miserable and minimal existence because that's like the right thing to do. You know, that's like the true anti-imperialist way of living. And I think that, you know, I learned a lot from that experience and it's interesting. But what I found really helpful about liberation theology in general is that dropping out of empire is actually a pretty bad way to end empire. And if that's your ultimate horizon, is that these empires should not exist on the earth, eating out of a dumpster or like, you know, walking around in sackcloth because you can't, I don't know, like find anything else to wear is like a pretty bad way to do it. And I think that's what I think is kind of interesting here. Like, the advice of Revelation is to basically be like, just don't participate, just drop out and then hold on. And eventually the empire will be undone by God's judgment. And I think that is actually politically bad advice. So maybe that's not exactly what Revelation is after. I'm willing to suspend judgment and wait and find out. But I think that is the political recommendation here, is like, hold on and, keep eating out of the trash.
Yeah, I think that's right. I was just kind of doing another quick skim over the texts that we had in front of us, just for looking for like where are the poor or the oppressed in it. And like I mentioned earlier, we do have like sort of the liturgical moments where the community is present, and in those liturgical moments, it's just saying that like God's just for doing all this stuff. Okay, fine. The other bit is that there are, in the scenes in heaven at the very beginning, the prayers of the people are going up to heaven, and they're like burning on an altar in front of God, and then like the smoke is going up to God as incense or something. And then like the angel takes like the coals of the prayers burning on the altar and then flings them down to earth, and like that's kind of it. But like, just like kind of like you're saying, that is also not great political advice to just pray about it. Sorry, the Bible, I guess I'll tell you, is bad advice. But yeah, I guess I'm not thrilled. I'm not sold on this as as great advice to the oppressed. But
yeah,
I don't know. Also, Jesus tells us in the Gospels that we'll go on to do greater things than these, and perhaps the sociological understanding of social movements and like political organizing are the greater things or something. Like maybe we've got things figured out that they did not have in Revelation. Jane McAlevey didn't exist then or something to tell us there are no shortcuts. Yeah.
The ultimate shortcut is just waiting around for God to sort it out. I think. Okay, another thing. This is bad to all of a sudden have these insights at the overtime moment of our podcast, but anyway, I'm going to say it anyway. This is the buzzer beater shot. Rosa Luxemburg and many other Marxists, but her in particular, they read the early church as having this communism of consumption. And that is a very beautiful thing in the Roman Empire. Everybody gets all their stuff together, and they consume it together, and they share it with those who have need. But what she says is insufficient is that they didn't discover the necessary communism of production, which creates, on the one hand, a mathematical problem, because at a certain point you're going to have more mouths to feed than you have stuff to feed them with. And on the other hand, it creates a kind of terminal date for the community, right? Like, you can't reproduce yourself, so it will just have to end. Or you'll have to go seeking contributions from rich people, which is what the church ended up doing, and created a class compromise. And she says, instead what we need is a communism of production, where we can understand the kind of long-term sustainable attempt to actually build a more just and equitable society. And I think the book of Revelation is actually a really interesting expression of the limitations of that communism of consumption model, right? Like, you do your best, you share what you can. That is really what John is after. He's trying to like ward off the class compromise moment in the church. And I think that's cool and laudatory. But the reason that that's happening is because they lack a theory of production. And so all you really can do is survive on the scraps. And that's also what compels the other churches that he judges to accommodate themselves to empire, because they have no theory of building that kind of alternative communism of production. And you've got to wait until later. You have to wait till monasticism, and then in modern society toward socialism and so on, to like kind of close that loop. So anyway, that is a very interesting thing I never thought about till now. And I guess it's a good cautionary tale where, like, if all you have is the dream of a communism of consumption, then I guess all you can really hope for is for, a kind of metaphysical solution, because you don't have a long-term political solution. So that's pretty troubling.
Okay, some people, if they were given the chance to time travel, they would go back and meet their grandparents. Some people would go back and kill baby Hitler. Me, I would go back and tell John of Patmos about social movements in the 21st century and how they work.
He would love that, and he definitely wouldn't start talking to you about the 7 weird squirrels he ate that morning.
The 7 trumpets of how to organize your coworkers.
An extremely constipated man.
Thanks for listening to Magnificast. If you like what you heard, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/themagnificast. If you do like what you heard, I'd be so surprised. This week, it was such a hard one, but we did pull it off in the end, and I'm really psyched about that. The Book of Revelation is a hard one to read, so I don't know. All of your support is helping us turn your Patreon contributions into weird podcasts, and we do deeply appreciate that. Guess what? We have a book coming out soon. In May, you'll be able to get the Magnificast book, Enough is Enough. You can order it from Fortress Press. You should definitely go do that. Pre-orders are so important for the book process, so go get it, and you can have it on launch day. That'll be so exciting. Our intro music is by Amari Armstrong. Our outro music is by The Illogical Spoon, and we'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord.